Got your parachute?
I forgot it.
How about the Wilkins coffee?
I forgot that too.
You'll never forget this.
So I just finished watching the Wandavision finale, so there will be spoilers. This is just some of my comments and thoughts and ideas on both the finale and the show as a whole. But, you know, so one of the things that I found particularly about this finale is that, you know, we've spent the previous I think 8 episodes, right, watching this show, and for the most part it was not your typical superhero show or film, right? It was very much you know, both a kind of quirky show, a show built around a mystery, a show that was playing with the medium and you know, playing with ideas of television, sitcoms, and how they've evolved over the years. But it wasn't a show built around this idea of a conflict, a physical conflict between a good guy and a bad guy. For sake, you know, this show was really about, I guess in a nutshell, Wanda and her feelings of grief and her coming to terms with loss in her life, right? And that was sort of the main theme, or even the main conflict behind this show. So that's why it was particularly kind of odd in the final episode to have it all come down to this, essentially this fight between Agatha and Wanda, like this witch battle, this magical battle taking place, you know, throughout that, you know, the denouement of that story, that episode was kind of built around that, right? And then, of course, there were other things as well, like the themes of grief and loss and all of that kind of thing. That was explored, but it just felt particularly odd for this show to have to put in that whole somewhat cliche sort of superhero battle at the end. I don't think it was, you know, I don't think it was bad. I don't think it was necessarily to the, you know, it wasn't poorly done, but it just felt really out of place, right? And this, you know, this show wasn't really leading to that. And the finale as a whole just gave me had me feel a little bit underwhelmed in a way. And there are reasons for that I can't necessarily fault the show for, but there's also just themes and ideas that they kind of explored, but then they didn't fully go into. Like, I felt like as much as important as Wanda's children were made out to be within the Hex, and as much as that was, you know, used within this episode as sort of a threat that Agatha held over her, I think the show was very very quickly and very tidily kind of brought an end to that. And I think the whole superhero battle thing was maybe part of the reason why, and maybe was even in a way kind of to the detriment of the series and the episode, you know, altogether, given that there were some aspects of her grief and her, you know, this version of her family that she's created within the Hex that I don't necessarily think that they dealt with in a satisfactory way. I mean, the stuff with Vision I thought was pretty good. Some of it kind of, again, felt very much unresolved, like the white Vision that was introduced in this episode, and that whole thing again kind of felt very tidily and very quickly kind of resolved in a way. So yeah, I have kind of mixed feelings about this episode, and it kind of makes me kind of reevaluate the whole series, right? Another part of it is that, and this is the part that I can't really fault the show for, because this is more me as a watcher, but I was really expecting this show to have a greater overall sort of impact on the MCU, and the reason why I thought that, and the show did things to kind of, I'm sure there are all kinds of theories going on about this show, especially as it was airing, and things like Evan Peters coming back as Pietro, as Quicksilver, reprising a role, or at least we thought reprising a role that he had played in the Fox Universe X-Men here in the MCU. And what I was really expecting this show to do, or what I should say, what I was hoping the show would do, would find a way to use Wanda to introduce the X-Men, or mutants as a whole, into the MCU, right? Because now that Disney owns the rights to the X-Men and the word mutant, which they couldn't use before, that's why in Avengers and even in this show, Wanda is not a mutant and is not the daughter of Magneto as she is in the comic books. But I was expecting her and her sort of reality warping powers to lead into that some way. And so when I saw Evan Peters show up, my brain, that idea in my head really started to percolate, because I was expecting this would have a greater all sort of meaning for the MCU. And it turned out that wasn't the case. So again, I can't fault this show for not doing that, because that was not the scope of this series. Although I will say, casting Evan Peters, if you're not going to make that significant in any way, and to have him end up being this character Ralph Boner is a little bit too metafictional of a joke, I think, in my opinion, to have that go on for several episodes. If you were going to introduce him in one episode and then reveal that he's not actually Pietro, he's actually this Ralph Boner guy, and also that name is ridiculous. But if you're going to do that in one episode, I would say, okay, fine. But to introduce him at the end of, I think, what was it, episode 5 or something like that, and then to have an entire episode where he appears, and then have him sort of, exist within that world, within that hex, which we know that people inside of that world that Wanda has created are not really as they appear. But I just thought that whole aspect was a little bit metafictional, and it was a little bit too much of teasing the audience in a way that, I don't know that was a good idea. But because here's the other thing too, I think that ultimately Wanda probably will still be used to do some kind of version of a House of M type of thing, except instead of making mutants disappear as I think she did in the comic books, I think she's going to be involved with that, and I think that's going to maybe be a way that they use to introduce the previously Fox-owned characters like the X-Men, and maybe even the Fantastic Four as well, through some kind of reality shift thing with Wanda. And the whole prophecy thing, which again, another cliche of not just superhero, but just, storytelling in general, any kind of fantasy storytelling that has prophecy in it, that's not justified or not interesting. For me, that's a kind of a really a grown-worthy sort of cliche to add into a story, especially in the 11th hour at the very end. I didn't really like that aspect, but I do think that will come into play in the MCU. Looking back at this show as a whole, it's kind of obvious now, I guess, that these Disney Plus shows are not going to be, they're not going to be directly connected to the MCU in the way that the films are. You know what I mean? They're going to be similar to kind of like what the Netflix shows were, I think, where the Netflix Marvel shows were kind of their own universe, and you never really saw those characters or those plot lines have any influence on the films. I think these Disney Plus shows are going to be more similar to that than like being their own little entrance into the film series. Because when you watch this entire series, I mean, there's really nothing that you missed out of if you don't have a Disney Plus subscription. That little bit that they teased with that book and Wanda's Dark Destiny, that whole thing, the majority of the series wasn't that. It was a very self-contained type of story, which is, again, fine. But, this just goes into, the sort of expectations that we have as audiences when we watch adaptations of franchises or adaptations of other stories, things that we have expectations of going into, things that we want to see particular things from. We go into these things with wanting to see this storyline or this or that play out, or the characters do this or that, right? There's all kinds of examples of that in other Disney-owned franchises. And, you can't watch media that way. You can't, excuse me. You can't compare this fantasy version of a story that you had in your head to the thing that you've got, because you're never going to get that film on screen. You're never going to get your perfect Star Wars tale or your perfect X-Men tale or your perfect whatever in a screen adaptation. So you can't really watch movies that way. But, I would not be honest to say that it wasn't a little bit of a disappointment that this show kind of didn't really go into any significant places as to the overall MCU. And, not a fault of this series as a television show, as a story in its own right, as a piece of art in its own right. I can't really judge it that way. But, in the overall scope of things, a little bit disappointing. So yeah, I guess that's the majority of my thoughts as it pertains. I guess the important points, I would say, is that one, the finale felt kind of tonally and kind of narratively kind of weird in the way that it sort of did what the rest of the series avoided, which is to do this typical sort of superhero conflict, this fight scene at the end. I felt like that was a little bit out of place, and that was uncharacteristic to what the rest of the show was. Because if you watched especially those first 2 or 3 episodes, where it was just straight up like a weird take on vintage sitcoms with a little bit of sprinkling of a greater mystery. If you made it through those episodes, you probably were pretty happy without there being a big fight at the end. And not that big fights are bad in stories, it's just here it felt kind of unearned and sort of out of place and uncharacteristic for what the rest of the show was. So that's one point. And the other point was, and again, like this is the more meta point, the more part where me as the viewer having these feelings about this thing in a way that relates to the rest of the franchise, is that I felt like this show, I was hoping, was going to be an opportunity to have this these greater ramifications for the rest of the MCU, and it ended up not being that at all, which is not, again, I wouldn't take negative, I wouldn't take points off my rating of the show if I were to rate it for this, because again, that's not fair. But it kind of just reaffirms this idea that the MCU as a whole, the films are all pretty decent, the films are all pretty good, but they're also all based off of a very safe formula so far. Like most of the movies are working off a formula, and sometimes it's very apparent. Sometimes it's very apparent that they're all using the same formula, and they're all playing it safe, right? Disney is a fairly risk-adverse company, and when you're adapting this concept that has existed in comic books for decades, right, of this interconnected universe, right, that Captain America and Hulk and the X-Men and all those characters in the comic books all are occurring in the same universe, generally at the same time. And so when there are these crossover events, that if you don't buy certain books in that series, you miss that part of the story. I felt like this show felt very much like it was a side story, like a little addendum, essentially, right? A little addendum or a little side note in the overall story of the Avengers or Wanda, and that, in the finale, it was very clear that, okay, the important part of what's happening with Wanda in regards to the greater MCU, we're going to do that in Doctor Strange 2 or whatever, right? So that's going to be cinema goers, if the cinemas ever open up again. But that movie universe, that's one thing. Don't worry with these shows, you ain't missing out on much, right? It's not like, and I'm not saying that to diminish the series, but it's not like, if you didn't go see Avengers Endgame in the theaters, then you were going to be spoiled for major events in this series. So even if you were kind of a casual fan, you might want to make sure that you saw that movie, because you're going to have things spoiled for you. With this show, overall, it's just so particular to one character that it doesn't really, like, all you need to know if you go into Doctor Strange 2 and you haven't seen the show was that Wanda basically is prophesized to do something bad, right? And she has, the scope of her powers are pretty large, and that she can warp reality in a pretty major way. But other than that, there wasn't a whole lot that you missed in terms of major plot points, right? So I guess I'll end it there. Hopefully I will be able to upload this. But if you want to hear more film, television thoughts, you can hit the subscriber button below, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell if you want to be notified when I upload a new video. I'm going to be probably doing more just sort of commentaries like this, my thoughts on, certain film or television things. I'm also going to be, I'm working on a couple of little video essays on films and stuff like that. I got a couple that I'm working on right now to do with the Terminator series. And I've got all kinds of different things that I've got on the drawing board, so to speak. So if you're interested in hearing any of that or seeing any of that, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell below.
Any last request, like for a cup of Wilkins coffee?
No,
You don't drink Wilkins?
no.
How shocking.
You see how easy it is to keep a man happy? Why not give your husband a carton of Philip Morris cigarettes?
Smart move. He'll love them for their mildness, their smoothness, and their wonderful good taste. And he'll love you, too, for thinking of him.
That's right. Good night, everybody. And don't forget, call for Philip Morris.